Good evening and welcome. Let our story be the sound that guides you toward rest. Tonight we visit the Battle of Shiloh. On the morning of April 6th, 1862, thousands of Union soldiers were leisurely cooking breakfast, believing they were perfectly safe. By lunchtime they were fighting for their lives against a surprise attack that should have been impossible. How was such a massive failure of intelligence possible? Furthermore, after the first day of brutal, unexpected fighting, General Grant's forces were shattered, backed up against the Tennessee River, with seemingly no escape. His generals urged retreat to save what was left of the army. But Grant, amidst the chaos and despair, calmly lit a cigar and made a decision that would define his career, a 36-hour gamble. He decided not to retreat, but to attack. What did Grant see that no one else did? What gave him the incredible confidence to believe he could turn utter catastrophe into victory? Get comfortable and let the details soothe you. We'll answer these questions and more as we explore this fascinating story from the American Civil War. Now, let our bedtime story begin. The early spring of 1862 saw Union forces in the Western Theater making significant inroads into Confederate territory. Following the captures of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February, Major General Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Tennessee had advanced southward along the Tennessee River. Their objective was to push deep into the Confederacy, disrupt rail lines, and eventually link up with Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio, which was marching overland from Nashville. By early April, Grant's army, numbering around 40,000 men, had established a sprawling encampment at Pittsburgh Landing on the west bank of the Tennessee River, near a small log meeting house called Shiloh Church, Shiloh being a Hebrew word meaning place of peace. Grant was awaiting Buell's arrival before launching a planned offensive against the vital Confederate rail junction at Corinth, Mississippi, about 20 miles to the southwest. Corinth was a critical transportation hub, connecting the Memphis and Charleston and Mobile and Ohio railroads, essential for Confederate logistics in the West. The Union encampment at Pittsburgh Landing was somewhat haphazard. Grant, perhaps overconfident after his recent victories and not expecting a major Confederate attack, had not ordered his divisions to construct significant defensive fortifications or entrenchments. His 5 divisions were spread out across a wide area, some units isolated, with little attention paid to establishing a strong, cohesive defensive line. Many of the troops were relatively green, having only recently volunteered. Grant himself had established his headquarters further downriver at Savannah, Tennessee, and was not initially present at Pittsburgh Landing when the battle commenced. Meanwhile, the Confederate High Command in the West was determined to strike back and reverse the tide of Union advances. General Albert Sidney Johnston, one of the Confederacy's most highly regarded senior officers, had managed to concentrate scattered Confederate forces at Corinth. His newly formed Army of Mississippi numbered around 44,000 men, roughly equal in strength to Grant's force at Pittsburgh Landing. Johnston's second-in-command was General P.G.T. Beauregard, the victor of Fort Sumter and First Bull Run. Johnston and Beauregard knew that if Grant and Buell united their armies, the combined Union force would be overwhelming. Their only hope was to attack Grant at Pittsburgh Landing before Buell could arrive, destroy his army, and then turn on Buell. It was a bold and desperate gamble. On April 3, 1862, Johnston's army began its march northward from Corinth towards Pittsburgh Landing. The Confederate advance was plagued by delays. Heavy rains turned the roads into quagmires, and the inexperienced troops struggled with march discipline. Logistical problems abounded. Beauregard, concerned about the loss of surprise due to the slow advance and reports of skirmishing, urged Johnston to call off the attack. However, Johnston, resolute in his determination to fight, overruled him, famously declaring, "I would fight them if they were 1,000,000." Despite the delays, the Confederates managed to approach the Union encampments largely undetected by Grant's senior commanders. While some Union patrols had reported Confederate activity, these warnings were often dismissed or downplayed. Colonel William T. Sherman, commanding one of Grant's divisions encamped near Shiloh Church, was particularly skeptical of reports of a major Confederate force nearby, believing them to be mere enemy reconnaissance. In the pre-dawn darkness of Sunday, April 6, 1862, Johnston's Confederate army, arrayed in 3 long lines of battle, launched a surprise attack on the unsuspecting Union encampments. The assault began around 4:45 a.m. when Confederate skirmishers encountered Union pickets from Major General Benjamin Prentice's division. The sleepy Union camps were quickly thrown into chaos as thousands of Confederate soldiers, letting out the rebel yell, surged forward. Many Union soldiers were caught completely unprepared, some still in their tents, others cooking breakfast. Tents were overrun, and entire regiments were forced to fall back in disarray, leaving behind their equipment and breakfast. The initial Confederate onslaught was overwhelming, particularly against the raw troops of Prentice's and Sherman's divisions, which bore the brunt of the early fighting. Despite the surprise and the initial panic, many Union units rallied and began to offer stiff resistance. The fighting quickly devolved into a series of brutal close-quarters engagements in the dense woods, tangled thickets, and small clearings that characterized the Shiloh battlefield. The terrain made grand tactical maneuvers difficult and often reduced the battle to a desperate struggle between individual regiments and brigades. General Grant, at his headquarters in Savannah, heard the distant roar of artillery and immediately realized a major battle was underway. He ordered Buell's advance elements to hasten their march and then sped upriver by steamboat to Pittsburgh Landing, arriving around 9 a.m. to find his army in a perilous situation, with several divisions shattered and pushed back towards the river. Throughout the morning and early afternoon of April 6th, the Confederates pressed their attack with ferocity. General Johnston was at the forefront, personally leading and inspiring his troops. The Union lines, though often yielding ground, did not completely break. Pockets of determined resistance bought precious time for Grant and his subordinates to try and establish a more stable defensive line. One of the most famous and fiercely contested areas of the battlefield became known as the Hornet's Nest. Here, elements of Prentice's division, along with parts of Brigadier General W.H.L. Wallace's division and other rallied units, took up a strong defensive position along a sunken road in a dense thicket. For nearly 6 hours, these Union soldiers, numbering around 4,500, repulsed repeated Confederate assaults. The Confederates massed over 60 pieces of artillery under Brigadier General Daniel Ruggles to pound the Hornets' Nest, but the Union defenders held firm, inflicting heavy casualties on the attackers. The stubborn defense of the Hornets' Nest was crucial. It delayed the Confederate advance, disrupted Johnston's timetable, and allowed Grant to form a final defensive line nearer to Pittsburgh Landing, anchored by massed artillery and supported by the timely arrival of lead elements of Buell's army on the opposite bank of the river. Around 2:30 p.m., tragedy struck the Confederate High Command. General Albert Sidney Johnston, while leading an attack on the Union left flank near a peach orchard, was struck in the right leg by a Minié ball. The bullet severed his popliteal artery. Unaware of the severity of his wound, or perhaps downplaying it, Johnston continued to direct his troops until he grew faint from blood loss and had to be helped from his horse. He died shortly thereafter, bleeding to death in a ravine. His death was a severe blow to the Confederacy, as he was widely considered one of its ablest commanders. Command of the Confederate Army devolved upon General Beauregard. By late afternoon, the Confederates finally managed to surround and overwhelm the defenders of the Hornets' Nest. Around 5:30 p.m., General Prentiss, with about 2,200 surviving Union soldiers, was forced to surrender. It was a significant tactical victory for the Confederates, but it had come at a terrible cost in time and manpower. As darkness began to fall on April 6th, Beauregard, believing Grant's army was on the verge of collapse and perhaps overestimating the exhaustion of his own troops, called off the Confederate attacks for the day. He expected to finish off the Union Army the next morning. This decision would prove controversial. Grant's final defensive line near Pittsburgh Landing, though battered, was holding, and crucially, reinforcements were arriving. Throughout the night, a torrential rainstorm drenched the battlefield, adding to the misery of the thousands of wounded soldiers from both sides who lay untended between the lines. The eerie sounds of their cries and groans, mingled with the rain and the occasional roar of Union gunboats, Tyler and Lexington shelling Confederate positions, created a nightmarish scene. During the night, the remainder of Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio, about 20,000 fresh troops, began to arrive at Pittsburgh Landing, ferried across the Tennessee River. Major General Lew Wallace's division of Grant's army, which had taken a wrong road and missed the first day's fighting, also finally arrived. On the morning of Monday, April 7th, the tables were turned. Grant, now reinforced by Buell's army and Wallace's division, launched a massive counterattack. The Confederates, exhausted from the previous day's fighting, short on ammunition, and demoralized by the unexpected arrival of fresh Union troops, were caught off guard. The fighting on the second day was just as savage as the first, but the momentum had shifted. Union forces, with their numerical superiority and fresh troops, gradually began to push the Confederates back over the same ground they had captured the day before. Beauregard struggled to organize a coherent defense. Key areas like Shiloh Church and the Hornet's Nest were retaken by Union forces after bloody fighting. By mid-afternoon on April 7th, Beauregard realized that his army was beaten. With his troops exhausted and his lines crumbling, he ordered a general retreat back towards Corinth. The Union army, though victorious, was also battered and disorganized and did not mount an effective large-scale pursuit. The Battle of Shiloh was over. It had been, up to that point, the bloodiest battle in American history. The scale of the carnage shocked both the North and the South. Union casualties numbered approximately 13,047, 1,754 killed, 8,408 wounded, 2,885 missing, captured. Confederate casualties were around 10,699, 1,728 killed, 8,012 wounded, 959 missing, captured. The combined total of nearly 24,000 casualties in 2 days of fighting was unprecedented and brought home the brutal reality of the war. Shiloh was a Union strategic victory, albeit a costly one. Grant's army had been surprised and nearly defeated on the first day, but it had held on, and with the arrival of reinforcements had driven the Confederates from the field on the second day. The Confederate attempt to destroy Grant's army before it could link up with Buell had failed. The victory at Shiloh solidified Union control over much of western Tennessee and paved the way for the eventual capture of Corinth, Mississippi, further crippling the Confederate war effort in the West. However, the battle also had significant repercussions for the commanders involved. Grant faced severe criticism in the Northern press, and from some politicians for being surprised and for the high number of casualties. There were calls for his removal from command. President Lincoln, however, stood by him, famously stating, "I can't spare this man, he fights." William T. Sherman, who had also been criticized for being surprised, emerged from Shiloh with his reputation enhanced due to his coolness and bravery under fire, forming a close and effective partnership with Grant that would last throughout the war. For the Confederacy, the loss at Shiloh, coupled with the death of Albert Sidney Johnston, was a devastating blow. It ended their hopes of regaining the initiative in the Western Theater in the spring of 1862. Beauregard's leadership also came under scrutiny for his decision to halt the attack on the evening of the first day. The Battle of Shiloh was a brutal lesson in the realities of industrial-scale warfare. It demonstrated the importance of preparedness, reconnaissance, and fortifications. The sheer ferocity of the fighting and the staggering number of casualties disabused many on both sides of any lingering notions that the war would be short or glorious. Shiloh, the place of peace, had become a byword for carnage and a grim foreshadowing of even bloodier battles to come, such as Antietam and Gettysburg. The Tennessee woods had witnessed a level of slaughter that would forever mark the American consciousness. In the spring of 1862, while Union armies were pressing deep into Confederate territory in Tennessee and Virginia, a critical Union naval expedition was underway aimed at capturing New Orleans, Louisiana. New Orleans was the Confederacy's largest city. its most important port and a vital economic and industrial center. Its capture would be a devastating blow to the Southern war effort, severing the Confederacy from its western states and opening the Mississippi River to Union control from the south. The primary defenses of New Orleans against a waterborne attack from the Gulf of Mexico were two formidable brick fortifications, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, situated on opposite banks of the Mississippi River, about 75 miles downstream from the city. These forts, though somewhat dated, mounted over 100 heavy cannons and were supported by a log and chain boom stretched across the river to obstruct navigation. Further upriver, a small Confederate naval force, known as the River Defense Fleet, consisting of cotton-clad rams and a few other vessels, including the partially completed ironclad CSS Louisiana and the nearly finished ironclad CSS Mississippi, still under construction at New Orleans, offered additional, albeit limited, resistance. The Union plan to capture New Orleans was largely conceived and championed by Assistant Secretary of the Navy Gustavus, 5th of Fox. The naval component of the expedition was entrusted to Flag Officer David Glasgow Farragut, a seasoned and aggressive naval officer of Southern birth, Tennessee, who had remained loyal to the Union. Farragut commanded the West Gulf Blockading Squadron, a powerful fleet of wooden steam sloops, corvettes, and gunboats. Accompanying the naval force was an army contingent of about 18,000 men under Major General Benjamin F. Butler, tasked with occupying New Orleans once the naval forces had overcome the city's defenses. Farragut's primary challenge was to get his deep-draft wooden warships past the formidable guns of Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip. Many believed this was impossible, advocating instead for a prolonged siege or a land-based assault. However, Farragut, a firm believer in bold offensive action, was convinced he could run his fleet past the forts under the cover of darkness. In mid-April 1862, Farragut assembled his fleet near the mouth of the Mississippi River. His main striking force consisted of 17 warships, including his flagship, the powerful steam sloop USS Hartford, and other notable vessels like the USS Brooklyn, USS Richmond, and USS Pensacola. To supplement this force, Commander David Dixon Porter, Farragut's foster brother, commanded a flotilla of 20 mortar schooners, each armed with a heavy 13-inch mortar. Porter's plan was to subject Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip to an intense, sustained bombardment from these mortars, hoping to silence their guns, demoralize their garrisons, and clear the way for Farragut's fleet to pass. On April 18, 1862, Porter's mortar schooners, cleverly camouflaged with tree branches and mud, anchored along the riverbanks just out of effective range of the fort's guns and began their bombardment. For 6 days and nights, the mortars rained down thousands of heavy shells on Fort Jackson, the primary target as it was closer and more heavily armed, and Fort St. Philip. The bombardment was deafening and relentless, shaking the very foundations of the forts and creating a hellish environment for the Confederate defenders. Inside Fort Jackson, commanded by Brigadier General Johnson K. Duncan, and Fort St. Philip under Colonel Edward Higgins, the Confederate garrisons endured the ordeal with considerable bravery. The mortar shells caused significant damage to the fort's structures, setting fire to barracks, dismounting some guns, and inflicting casualties. However, the fort's main defensive capabilities were not destroyed. The garrisons worked tirelessly to repair damage and keep their guns in action. The bombardment, while terrifying, failed to achieve its primary objective of silencing the forts. Farragut, growing impatient with the slow progress of the mortar bombardment and concerned about dwindling supplies and the morale of his men, decided he could wait no longer. He resolved to execute his daring plan to run his fleet past the forts under the cover of darkness, despite the risks. He meticulously prepared his ships for the ordeal, ordering their hulls camouflaged, their decks whitewashed for visibility in the dark, and chain cables draped over their sides as makeshift armor to protect their engines. Excess spars and rigging were taken down to reduce the risk of fire and falling debris. In the early morning hours of April 24th, 1862, around 2 a.m., Farragut gave the signal to advance. The Union fleet, divided into 3 divisions, steamed upriver in 2 columns, one led by Farragut in the Hartford, the other by Captain Theodorus Bailey. The night was dark, but the scene was soon illuminated by the flash of cannons, the glare of Confederate bonfires lit along the riverbanks, and the burning hulks of fire rafts sent downriver by the Confederates in an attempt to disrupt the Union advance. As Farragut's ships approached the boom, Union gunboats managed to create a narrow opening through which the fleet began to pass. Immediately, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip erupted with a furious barrage of cannon fire. The Union warships, their own guns blazing, responded in kind. The narrow confines of the river became a scene of incredible chaos and violence, a deafening inferno of shot and shell, smoke and flame. The USS Hartford, Farragut's flagship, had a particularly perilous passage. At one point it ran aground near Fort St. Philip and was struck by a fire raft, setting the ship ablaze. Farragut famously lashed to the rigging to get a better view above the smoke, though this detail is sometimes disputed or attributed to later battles, calmly directed the firefighting efforts while continuing to engage the forts. The Hartford managed to extinguish the flames, free itself from the mud, and continue upriver. Other Union ships also endured a heavy pounding. The USS Brooklyn collided with another Union vessel in the smoke and confusion and was temporarily disabled. Several ships were hit multiple times, suffering casualties and damage. However, the speed of the steam-powered warships, the darkness, and the smoke from the gunfire made it difficult for the Confederate gunners to aim effectively. The small Confederate river defense fleet and the partially completed ironclad CSS Louisiana, which was essentially an immobile floating battery at this stage, also engaged Farragut's fleet, but they were outmatched and outgunned. Several Confederate vessels were sunk or driven ashore. The CSS Manassas, a small but formidable Confederate ram, managed to strike several Union ships, including the Brooklyn and the Mississippi, before being disabled and run aground. Despite the fierce resistance, the majority of Farragut's fleet, 13 out of 17 warships, successfully ran the gauntlet of the forts and the Confederate flotilla. The passage took about an hour and a half. It was a remarkable feat of naval skill, daring, and determination. Once past the forts, Farragut's fleet faced little further opposition on its way to New Orleans. The city itself was largely undefended, its best troops having been sent to other theaters of war. Panic gripped New Orleans as news of the fleet's approach arrived. Confederate authorities, including Major General Mansfield Lovell, the military commander, realized the city could not be held. They ordered the destruction of cotton, ships, and military supplies to prevent them from falling into Union hands. The unfinished ironclad CSS Mississippi was burned at its dock. On April 25, 1862, Farragut's fleet anchored before New Orleans. He demanded the surrender of the city. Mayor John T. Monroe initially refused to formally surrender, arguing that the city was under martial law. However, with Union warships dominating the waterfront and their guns trained on the city, resistance was futile. On April 29th, after several days of tense negotiations and demonstrations of force by Farragut, the U.S. flag was formally raised over the U.S. Mint in New Orleans, signifying the city's capture. Meanwhile, downriver, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, now isolated and cut off from resupply, continued to hold out for a few more days against Porter's mortar flotilla and the remaining Union naval forces. However, the garrisons, demoralized by the news of the fleet's passage and the fall of New Orleans, began to mutiny. On April 28th, the forts were surrendered to Commander Porter. The capture of New Orleans was a strategic masterstroke for the Union and a devastating blow to the Confederacy. It closed the Confederacy's largest port, crippled its economy, and gave the Union control of the lower Mississippi River, a vital step towards cutting the Confederacy in two, which would be completed with the fall of Vicksburg in 1863. The loss of New Orleans also had a significant psychological impact on the South and boosted morale in the North. Major General Benjamin Butler's army arrived and occupied New Orleans on May 1st, 1862. Butler's subsequent administration of the city would be highly controversial, earning him the derisive nickname Beast Butler among Southerners. But his firm control helped to secure the Union hold on the city. David Glasgow Farragut became a national hero in the North for his daring and successful operation. He was promoted to Rear Admiral, the first officer to hold that rank in the U.S. Navy. His victory at New Orleans demonstrated the effectiveness of bold naval leadership and the ability of determined naval forces to overcome formidable fixed defenses. The battle for New Orleans was primarily a naval victory, showcasing the power of steam-driven warships and the strategic importance of controlling major waterways. Casualties were relatively light for such a significant engagement. The Union Navy suffered 37 killed and 149 wounded during the passage of the forts. Confederate losses in the forts and on their vessels were also modest, though the strategic loss of the city and its resources was immense. The fall of New Orleans, combined with Union victories in Tennessee, marked a turning point in the Western theater in the spring of 1862. The Confederacy's grip on the Mississippi Valley was slipping, and the Union was steadily advancing its strategic objectives. Farragut's dash past the forts was a testament to courage, skill, and the transformative power of naval innovation in the age of steam and iron. In late May 1862, Major General George B. McClellan's massive Union Army of the Potomac had advanced up the Virginia Peninsula to within a few miles of Richmond, the Confederate capital. McClellan, ever cautious, had established his supply base at White House Landing on the Pamunkey River and was slowly positioning his forces for a siege of Richmond. His army, numbering over 100,000 men, was divided by the Chickahominy River, a swampy and unpredictable waterway prone to flooding. Two Union Corps, the Third Corps under Brigadier General Samuel P. Heintzelman and the Fourth Corps under Brigadier General Erasmus D. Keyes, were positioned south of the Chickahominy, relatively isolated from the main body of the army to the north of the river. The Confederate commander, General Joseph E. Johnston, recognized the vulnerability of this exposed Union wing. Johnston, outnumbered by McClellan's overall force, saw an opportunity to attack and defeat the two isolated Union Corps before they could be reinforced from across the flood-swollen Chickahominy. His plan was complex, involving the coordinated movement of several Confederate divisions to converge on the Union positions near a crossroads known as Seven Pines and a nearby railway station called Fair Oaks Station. The terrain was difficult, characterized by dense woods, swampy ground, and few roads, which would complicate the Confederate movements. Johnston's plan called for Major General James Longstreet's division, though Longstreet was actually to command a wing of several divisions, to advance along the 9-mile road and attack the Union front, while Major General D.H. Hill's division would strike the Union right flank. Major General Gustavus W. Smith's division was to support Longstreet, and Major General Benjamin Huger's division was to advance on the Charles City Road to protect the Confederate right flank and potentially strike the Union left. The attack was scheduled to begin early on the morning of May 31st, 1862. However, from the outset, Johnston's plan began to unravel. Heavy rainstorms on the night of May 30th to 31st turned the roads into quagmires, slowing the Confederate advance. Orders were misunderstood or poorly communicated. Longstreet, instead of taking the 9-mile road as intended for his main thrust, mistakenly marched his division down the Williamsburg Road, which led him directly into D.H. Hill's path, causing significant delays and traffic jams. Huger's division also made slow progress on the Charles City Road. Despite these initial setbacks, the Confederates eventually launched their assault around 1 p.m. on May 31st, several hours behind schedule. D.H. Hill's division, leading the attack on the Williamsburg Road, struck the exposed IV Corps division of Brigadier General Silas Casey near Seven Pines. Casey's division, composed largely of inexperienced troops, was positioned in an advanced and somewhat isolated salient, protected by hastily constructed earthworks and an abatis, a barrier of felled trees. The Confederate attack, though uncoordinated in its initial stages, was pressed with ferocity. Hill's veterans, despite the difficult terrain, overwhelmed Casey's raw troops. The Union soldiers, many under fire for the first time, fought bravely in some instances, but were ultimately forced to fall back in considerable disorder, abandoning their camps and several artillery pieces. The Confederates surged forward, capturing Casey's first line of defenses. Brigadier General Darius N. Couch's division of the 4th Corps, positioned behind Casey, attempted to stem the Confederate tide. Fierce fighting erupted around the Seven Pines crossroads and the twin farmhouses. The battle swayed back and forth as both sides fed reinforcements into the struggle. The dense woods and swampy ground made command and control extremely difficult, and the fighting often devolved into brutal, close-quarters combat between individual regiments. Union Corps commanders Heintzelman and Keyes struggled to rally their troops and establish a coherent defensive line. The situation for the Union forces south of the Chickahominy was becoming increasingly desperate. McClellan, at his headquarters north of the river, was slow to react, initially underestimating the scale of the Confederate attack. However, one Union Corps commander north of the river, Brigadier General Edwin Fifth Sumner, commander of the 2nd Corps, acted decisively on his own initiative. Hearing the roar of battle, Sumner, a tough old regular army veteran, marched his 2 divisions towards the sound of the guns. Despite orders from McClellan's staff to hold his position, Sumner, recognizing the gravity of the situation, ordered his men to cross the dangerously swollen Chickahominy River over a rickety, partially submerged structure known as the Grapevine Bridge. It was a perilous crossing, but Sumner's lead division, under Brigadier General John Sedgwick, managed to get across just in time to reinforce the hard-pressed Union right flank near Fair Oaks Station. Sedgwick's arrival was critical. His fresh troops slammed into the advancing Confederates of G.W. Smith's division, which had eventually come into action after Longstreet's and Hill's initial assaults. The fighting around Fair Oaks Station was intense. The timely intervention of Sumner's corps blunted the Confederate momentum on this part of the field and helped to stabilize the Union line. As evening approached, another pivotal event occurred. General Joseph E. Johnston, while riding near the front lines to encourage his troops, was struck by a Union shell fragment in the shoulder and then by a musket ball in the chest. He was severely wounded and had to be carried from the field. Command of the Confederate Army devolved upon Major General Gustavus W. Smith, who was the senior Major General present. Johnston's wounding at a critical moment in the battle added to the confusion in the Confederate command. The fighting on May 31st gradually died down with darkness. The Confederates had gained considerable ground, pushing back the Union 4th Corps and inflicting heavy casualties. However, they had failed to achieve their objective of destroying the 2 isolated Union corps. The timely arrival of Sumner's corps had prevented a complete Union collapse south of the Chickahominy. Both armies, exhausted and bloodied, bivouacked on the field amidst their dead and wounded. On the morning of June 1st, the battle resumed, though with less intensity than the previous day. There were further Confederate attacks, particularly against the Union positions near Fair Oaks Station, but they were largely uncoordinated and repulsed by the now reinforced Union lines. Union forces also launched some local counterattacks, regaining some of the ground lost the previous day. By midday on June 1st, it became clear to G.W. Smith that further Confederate attacks would be futile. The Union position was now too strong, with ample reinforcements having crossed the Chickahominy. Smith ordered his forces to begin withdrawing to their original lines closer to Richmond. The Battle of 7 Pines, or Fair Oaks as it was known in the North, named after the two nearby landmarks where the heaviest fighting occurred on different parts of the field, was over. The battle was a bloody and tactically inconclusive affair, though it could be considered a Union strategic victory as they held the field and the Confederate attempt to crush a portion of McClellan's army had failed. Casualties were heavy on both sides. The Union suffered approximately 5,031 casualties, 790 killed, 3,594 wounded, 647 missing, captured. Confederate casualties were around 6,134, 980 killed, 4,749 wounded, 405 missing, captured. The most significant consequence of the Battle of 7 Pines was not tactical but related to Confederate command. With General Joseph E. Johnston severely wounded, Confederate President Jefferson Davis needed to find a new commander for the main Confederate army defending Richmond. On June 1, 1862, Davis appointed General Robert E. Lee to command what Lee would soon rename the Army of Northern Virginia. This decision would have a profound and lasting impact on the course of the Civil War. Lee, a brilliant and audacious strategist, would transform the character of the war in the Eastern Theater. For McClellan, 7 Pines was another missed opportunity. Despite having a numerically superior army, he had been caught off guard and had failed to decisively defeat the Confederates. The battle further reinforced his natural caution and his tendency to overestimate enemy strength. He would spend the next few weeks reorganizing his army and calling for more reinforcements, rather than pressing his advantage against Richmond. The Battle of 7 Pines, Fair Oaks, was a confusing and poorly managed battle on both sides, fought in difficult terrain by many inexperienced troops. It highlighted the challenges of command and control in large-scale Civil War engagements. The heavy casualties also provided another grim reminder of the escalating brutality of the conflict. While it did not achieve a decisive result on the battlefield, its consequence, the elevation of Robert E. Lee to command, set the stage for the dramatic and bloody 7 days battles that would follow later in June, fundamentally altering the course of the Peninsula Campaign. The appointment of General Robert E. Lee to command the Confederate forces defending Richmond on June 1, 1862, following General Joseph E. Johnston's wounding at 7 Pines, marked a dramatic turning point in the Peninsula Campaign and indeed the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. Major General George B. McClellan's massive Union Army of the Potomac was still positioned perilously close to the Confederate capital, with its right flank north of the Chickahominy River and its left flank south of it. McClellan, despite his numerical superiority, remained cautious, continuing to call for reinforcements and slowly preparing for a siege. Lee, in stark contrast, was an officer characterized by audacity and a preference for offensive action. he immediately began to plan a counterstroke designed to drive McClellan's army away from Richmond and relieve the threat to the capital. For nearly a month, Lee meticulously reorganized his army, which he officially named the Army of Northern Virginia. He strengthened Richmond's fortifications, not to passively defend, but to allow him to concentrate the bulk of his forces for an offensive blow. Lee's plan was daring. He would leave a relatively small force under Major Generals Benjamin Huger and John B. Magruder to defend Richmond south of the Chickahominy against McClellan's main body. He would then concentrate the majority of his army, about 65,000 men, north of the river to attack Brigadier General Fitz-John Porter's V Corps, which formed McClellan's exposed right flank. A key element of Lee's plan involved the arrival of Major General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson's command from the Shenandoah Valley. Jackson, fresh from his brilliant Valley campaign, where he had outmaneuvered and defeated several Union forces, was ordered to march his troops rapidly and secretly to join Lee's army. Jackson's role was to strike Porter's right flank and rear, initiating the Confederate offensive. Lee hoped that by crushing Porter's corps and threatening McClellan's supply line, which ran from White House Landing on the Pamunkey River via the Richmond and York River Railroad, he could force McClellan to abandon his siege and retreat. The series of engagements that unfolded from June 25th to July 1st, 1862, became known as the 7 Days Battles. Battle of Oak Grove, June 25th, 1862. The 7 Days Battles began somewhat inauspiciously with a minor Union offensive action. On June 25th, McClellan ordered elements of Brigadier General Samuel P. Heintzelman's Third Corps to advance along the Williamsburg Road south of the Chickahominy near Oak Grove, also known as King's Schoolhouse or the Orchards. The objective was to secure better ground for Union siege artillery. The Union troops made some initial gains against Confederate defenders from Huger's division, but were eventually pushed back. The fighting was inconclusive and relatively minor, but it marked the opening of a week of intense and continuous combat. Battle of Beaver Dam Creek, Mechanicsville, June 26, 1862. Lee intended to launch his main offensive on June 26th. Jackson's arrival was expected to trigger the assault. However, Jackson's troops, exhausted from their long march from the valley, were behind schedule. Impatient and perhaps misinterpreting the situation, Major General A.P. Hill, commanding one of Lee's divisions, launched a premature frontal assault against Porter's strongly entrenched V Corps position along Beaver Dam Creek near Mechanicsville, without waiting for Jackson to get into position on Porter's flank. Porter's men, well protected by earthworks and supported by superior artillery, repulsed A.P. Hill's repeated attacks with heavy Confederate casualties. The terrain, a swampy creek bottom, further hampered the Confederate assaults. Though Jackson's troops began to arrive late in the day, they were not significantly engaged. Tactically, Beaver Dam Creek was a clear Union victory. Porter had successfully defended his position and inflicted severe losses on the attackers. However, Lee's strategic objective was beginning to take shape. The presence of Jackson on his flank and rear convinced McClellan that his supply line to White House Landing was untenable. That night, McClellan made the crucial decision to abandon his advance on Richmond and to change his base of supply from the Pamunkey River to the James River, a move that would necessitate a difficult retreat of his entire army across the peninsula. Battle of Gaines Mill, First Cold Harbor, Chickahominy River, June 27, 1862. Following the fighting at Beaver Dam Creek, Porter withdrew his 5th Corps eastward to a new defensive position behind Boatswain's Swamp near Gaines's Mill. Lee, determined to crush Porter, renewed his attacks on June 27th. This time, Lee was able to bring more of his forces to bear, including the divisions of Longstreet, D.H. Hill, and A.P. Hill, along with Jackson's command, which was now more fully engaged, though still not as effectively coordinated as Lee had hoped. Porter's V Corps, numbering about 34,000 men, having been reinforced, faced nearly 57,000 Confederates. The battle raged throughout the afternoon, with the Confederates launching a series of determined but often uncoordinated assaults against the strong Union defensive line. The Union troops fought with great tenacity, and their artillery was particularly effective. For hours, Porter's men held their ground against superior numbers. Late in the afternoon, a massive coordinated Confederate assault, led by the divisions of Longstreet and Whiting under Jackson's overall command, finally broke through Porter's line. The Union defenses crumbled, and Porter's corps was driven back in considerable disorder towards the Chickahominy River. Only the timely arrival of darkness and the heroic efforts of Union cavalry and artillery rear guards prevented a complete rout and allowed Porter's men to escape across the river. Gaines's Mill was the largest battle of the 7 days and a significant Confederate tactical victory, though it came at a high cost. Confederate casualties were heavy, around 8,700, while Union losses were about 6,800. The battle convinced McClellan to accelerate his retreat towards the James River. He ordered his supply depots at White House Landing destroyed and began the difficult process of moving his massive army and its enormous wagon trains southward through the swampy terrain of the peninsula. Battle of Garnett's and Golding's Farms, June 27th to 28th, 1862. While the main fighting was occurring north of the Chickahominy at Gaines's Mill, there were also actions south of the river. On June 27th and 28th, Confederate forces under Magruder conducted demonstrations and minor attacks against the Union lines near Garnett's and Golding's Farms. These actions were primarily intended to deceive McClellan about Lee's true intentions and to pin down Union forces south of the river. Though the fighting was not as intense as at Gaines's Mill, it added to the pressure on the Union Army. Battle of Savage's Station, June 29, 1862. As McClellan's army retreated southward, Lee sought to intercept and destroy it. On June 29th, Confederate forces under Magruder, with Jackson's command expected to support but failing to arrive in time or force, attacked the Union rearguard, primarily Sumner's 2nd Corps, near Savage's Station on the Richmond and York River Railroad. the Union troops fought a determined delaying action, repulsing Magruder's attacks and allowing the bulk of the Union army and its wagon trains to continue their retreat. A large Union field hospital and many wounded soldiers were abandoned at Savage's Station and fell into Confederate hands. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but strategically successful for the Union in that it protected the ongoing retreat. Battle of Glendale, Fraser's Farm, Nelson's Farm, White Oak Swamp, June 30th, 1862. June 30th saw some of the most confused and desperate fighting of the 7 days. Lee's plan was to converge several Confederate divisions on the retreating Union columns at the vital crossroads of Glendale, or Fraser's Farm. If successful, this could have cut McClellan's army in two and led to its destruction. Longstreet's and A.P. Hill's divisions launched a fierce attack on the Union line near Glendale, held by elements of Heintzelman's, Sumner's, and Franklin's corps. The fighting was intense and often hand-to-hand. However, Lee's complex plan for a coordinated attack once again fell apart. Huger's division was delayed by felled trees and failed to engage effectively. Jackson's command, tasked with crossing White Oak Swamp and striking the Union rear, was held up by a small Union force under Brigadier General William B. Franklin and effective Union artillery at White Oak Bridge. Jackson's uncharacteristic lethargy and failure to press his attack at White Oak Swamp allowed crucial Union reinforcements to reach the Glendale sector. Despite the lack of coordination, Longstreet and A.P. Hill inflicted heavy casualties and nearly broke the Union line. Several Union generals, including George A. McCall, captured, and George G. Meade, wounded, became casualties. However, the Union troops, though hard-pressed, managed to hold their ground until darkness ended the fighting. The Battle of Glendale was a brutal and chaotic engagement, but the Union Army had once again managed to fend off Lee's attempt to deliver a knockout blow. McClellan himself was largely absent from the battlefield, having already proceeded to Malvern Hill near the James River. Battle of Malvern Hill, July 1st, 1862. By July 1st, McClellan's army had successfully reached Malvern Hill, a strong natural defensive position overlooking the James River. Malvern Hill was an elevated plateau with open fields sloping down to the front, offering excellent fields of fire for Union artillery. The Union Army occupied this position in strength, with over 250 artillery pieces massed to command the approaches. Porter's 5 Corps, along with elements of other corps, formed the main defensive line. Union gunboats on the James River also provided fire support. Lee, despite the exhaustion of his troops and the strength of the Union position, was determined to make one more attempt to destroy McClellan's army. He ordered a series of frontal assaults against Malvern Hill. However, Confederate staff work was poor, and the attacks were launched piecemeal and with little coordination throughout the afternoon and early evening. Confederate artillery was unable to effectively counter the superior Union artillery concentration. The Confederate infantry, advancing bravely across the open fields under a murderous hail of Union cannon and rifle fire, were slaughtered. Division after division was repulsed with horrific casualties. D.H. Hill, whose division suffered heavily, later described the assaults as not war, it was murder. The Union defenders, secure behind their guns and with clear fields of fire, inflicted devastating losses on the attacking Confederates. The Battle of Malvern Hill was a clear and decisive Union tactical victory. The Confederate assaults were futile and resulted in staggering losses, around 5,600 casualties, compared to Union losses of about 3,000. It was a bloody repulse that effectively ended Lee's offensive campaign. Aftermath. Following the Battle of Malvern Hill, McClellan, despite having won a significant defensive victory and being in a strong position on the James River with naval support, chose to withdraw his army further to Harrison's Landing, effectively ending the Peninsula Campaign. He continued to believe he was outnumbered and remained reluctant to resume the offensive. The 7 days' battles were a complex and bloody series of engagements. Tactically, the Confederates won several victories, notably Gaines' Mill, and forced the Union Army to retreat. However, Lee's primary strategic objective, the destruction of McClellan's army, was not achieved. The cost for the Confederacy was enormous. Over 20,000 casualties, approximately 3,494 killed, 15,758 wounded, 952 missing, captured, out of about 90,000 men engaged throughout the week. Union casualties were also heavy, around 16,000, approximately 1,734 killed, 8,062 wounded, 6,053 missing, captured, out of about 105,000. Despite the heavy losses, the 7 days' battles were a strategic triumph for the Confederacy. Lee had successfully defended Richmond, driven a massive Union army away from the capital, and seized the strategic initiative in the Eastern Theater. His audacious leadership and the fighting spirit of the Army of Northern Virginia had transformed the military situation. The morale of the Confederacy soared, while the North was once again plunged into dismay. The 7 days' battles demonstrated Robert E. Lee's aggressive style of command and his willingness to take risks. They also highlighted some of the command and control problems within the Confederate Army, particularly the difficulties in coordinating large-scale attacks and the sometimes erratic performance of some of Lee's subordinates, including Stonewall Jackson, whose performance during the 7 days was generally considered below his usual brilliant standard. For McClellan, the 7 days marked the failure of his elaborately planned Peninsula Campaign. While he skillfully managed the retreat and change of base to the James River, his inherent caution and his failure to capitalize on opportunities such as after Malvern Hill, drew heavy criticism. The threat to Richmond had been lifted, and the war in the East would take a different turn, leading to the Second Battle of Bull Run and the Maryland Campaign later that summer and fall. The fields around Richmond had witnessed some of the bloodiest fighting of the war to date, and the conflict was far from over. The summer of 1862 saw a dramatic shift in the strategic situation in the Eastern Theater. Following General Robert E. Lee's successful defense of Richmond during the 7 days' battles, Major General George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac had withdrawn to Harrison's Landing on the James River, while McClellan licked his wounds and called for more reinforcements. A new Union Army, the Army of Virginia, was formed under the command of Major General John Pope. Pope, who had achieved some success in the Western theatre, was brought east with much fanfare and a rather bombastic attitude, famously issuing proclamations that alienated his own officers and contrasted sharply with the more cautious McClellan. Pope's Army of Virginia, composed of several corps drawn from various departments, was tasked with advancing southward from Washington, D.C. to threaten Richmond from the north and draw Lee's attention away from McClellan. The strategic goal was for Pope and McClellan to eventually unite their forces and crush Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Lee, however, was not inclined to wait passively. Recognizing the danger of facing two large Union armies simultaneously, he decided to strike Pope before McClellan could effectively reinforce him from the peninsula. Leaving a small force to watch McClellan, Lee moved the bulk of his army northward to confront Pope. Lee's plan involved a characteristic maneuver of audacity and risk. He decided to divide his army in the face of a numerically superior, though somewhat dispersed, enemy. He dispatched Major General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson with about 24,000 men on a wide flanking march to get into Pope's rear, cut his supply line, the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, and force him into a disadvantageous battle. Lee, with the remainder of his army, primarily Major General James Longstreet's corps, about 30,000 men, would follow, hoping to reunite with Jackson at the decisive moment. In late August, Jackson executed his march with remarkable speed and secrecy. His foot cavalry covered over 50 miles in 2 days, sweeping around Pope's right flank. On August 26th, Jackson's men struck the Orange and Alexandria Railroad at Bristow Station, and then, more significantly, captured Pope's massive Union supply depot at Manassas Junction. After allowing his hungry and footsore troops to feast on the captured Union supplies, an event that became known as the Great Sacking of Manassas, Jackson ordered the remaining stores destroyed on August 27th. This audacious raid threw Pope's army into confusion and disarray, forcing Pope to abandon his advance and turn his attention to finding and bagging Jackson. Pope, initially bewildered by Jackson's movements, eventually realized the threat to his rear and began to concentrate his scattered corps to intercept and destroy Jackson's isolated force before Lee and Longstreet could arrive. Jackson, after destroying the Manassas depot, withdrew his command to a strong defensive position along an unfinished railroad grade near Groveton, just northwest of the old First Bull Run, First Manassas battlefield. Here, concealed by woods, he awaited Pope's inevitable attack and hoped for Longstreet's timely arrival. On the afternoon of August 28th, elements of Pope's army, specifically Brigadier General Rufus King's division of McDowell's corps, were marching eastward along the Warrenton Turnpike near Groveton. Jackson, concerned that Pope might be withdrawing towards Centerville without giving battle, decided to reveal his position and provoke a fight. He ordered his artillery to open fire and then launched an attack on King's division. The ensuing engagement, known as the Battle of Brawner's Farm or Groveton, was a fierce and bloody stand-up fight that lasted for several hours until darkness. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but Jackson had successfully drawn Pope's attention and fixed him in place. King's division, though badly battered, held its ground. Pope, mistakenly believing he had Jackson trapped, became even more determined to destroy him. He issued a series of orders throughout the night of August 28th and the morning of August 29th to concentrate his corps for an all-out assault on Jackson's position along the unfinished railroad. Pope was largely unaware that Lee and Longstreet were rapidly approaching from the west, marching through Thoroughfare Gap in the Bull Run Mountains, a pass that Union forces had failed to adequately secure. On August 29th, Pope launched a series of determined but uncoordinated and piecemeal assaults against Jackson's well-entrenched line. Jackson's men, though outnumbered and under immense pressure, repulsed attack after attack throughout the day. The fighting was particularly severe, with Union brigades from Sigel's Corps, Hooker's Corps, and Reno's Corps being thrown against the Confederate defenses. The unfinished railroad cut provided excellent cover for Jackson's veterans, who inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking Union formations. Crucially, by mid-morning on August 29th, Longstreet's corps began to arrive on the field to Jackson's right, extending the Confederate line southward along the Warrenton Turnpike. Pope, however, seemed to remain fixated on Jackson and either ignored or downplayed reports of Longstreet's arrival. He continued to order assaults against Jackson's front, believing he was on the verge of crushing him. Some Union commanders on the field, notably Fitz-John Porter, commanding the 5th Corps, which had been detached from McClellan's army and sent to Pope, were aware of Longstreet's presence on their left flank and were hesitant to attack Jackson frontally as Pope ordered, fearing an attack from Longstreet. Porter's subsequent failure to attack Jackson on August 29th, based on his assessment of the danger from Longstreet, would later lead to his controversial court-martial and dismissal from the army, a verdict eventually overturned decades later. Throughout the day, Lee urged Longstreet to attack Pope's exposed left flank, but Longstreet, characteristically cautious and perhaps wanting more reconnaissance and a better understanding of the terrain, demurred. This delay allowed Pope to continue his futile assaults against Jackson. By the end of August 29th, Jackson's line, though severely battered and running low on ammunition in some sectors, had held firm against repeated Union attacks. Pope, still mistakenly believing he had won a victory and that Jackson was retreating, planned to renew his pursuit the next day. On the morning of August 30th, Pope, convinced Jackson was in full retreat, ordered a reconnaissance in force. When this met with Confederate resistance, he ordered a general assault against Jackson's line around 3 p.m., believing he was delivering the final blow to a weakened enemy. Porter's V Corps, now under direct orders from Pope, was heavily involved in this attack. The Union assault was pressed with determination, but once again met with stubborn resistance from Jackson's men along the railroad grade. As the Union attack against Jackson reached its climax and began to falter, Lee seized his opportunity. He ordered Longstreet to launch a massive counterattack with 5 divisions, some 25,000 men, against Pope's exposed left flank. Longstreet's assault, delivered with overwhelming force and supported by a powerful concentration of artillery, shattered the Union left. Union divisions under McDowell and Sigel were caught in the flank and rear and collapsed. The scene on the Union left rapidly degenerated into a rout, reminiscent of the First Battle of Bull Run a year earlier. Thousands of Union soldiers streamed rearward in disorder. Pope's entire army was now threatened with envelopment. Only a desperate and heroic stand by isolated Union brigades on Chin Ridge and later on Henry House Hill, the scene of Jackson's famous stand at First Bull Run, managed to slow the Confederate onslaught and buy enough time for the bulk of Pope's army to make a disorganized retreat back towards Centreville and the defenses of Washington. The fighting on Chin Ridge and Henry House Hill was particularly savage, with Union troops fighting desperately to hold off Longstreet's advancing tide. The 5th New York, Durier's Zouaves, and the 10th New York, National Zouaves, suffered horrendous casualties in their efforts to delay the Confederates. By nightfall on August 30th, Lee had won a stunning and decisive victory. Pope's Army of Virginia was thoroughly defeated and in full retreat. Lee, however, did not order an immediate large-scale pursuit that night, as his own army was also exhausted from several days of hard marching and fighting. The Second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas, was a disaster for the Union. Pope's army suffered approximately 13,824 casualties, 1,716 killed, 8,215 wounded, 3,893 missing captured, out of about 70,000 engaged. Confederate losses were also heavy, around 8,353, 1,305 killed, 7,048 wounded, out of about 55,000. The immediate aftermath saw Pope's discredited army fall back to the fortifications around Washington, D.C. Pope himself was relieved of command, and his Army of Virginia was merged into McClellan's Army of the Potomac. The defeat caused widespread gloom and recrimination in the North. For Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, Second Bull Run was a masterpiece of strategy and tactics. Lee's audacious plan to divide his army, Jackson's brilliant flanking march and stand, and Longstreet's decisive counterattack had completely outmaneuvered and overwhelmed a numerically superior Union force. The victory cleared most of Virginia of Union troops and opened the way for Lee's first invasion of the North, the Maryland Campaign, which would follow shortly. The battle highlighted Lee's genius for maneuver and his ability to inspire his army to achieve remarkable feats. It also showcased the effective partnership between Lee, Jackson, and Longstreet, who, despite occasional differences, formed the core of the Army of Northern Virginia's highly successful command structure. Conversely, the battle exposed the flaws in Union high command, particularly Pope's overconfidence, his poor reconnaissance, his failure to understand the tactical situation, especially regarding Longstreet's arrival, and his inability to effectively coordinate the actions of his corps commanders. The bickering and lack of cooperation among some Union generals also contributed to the defeat. The Second Battle of Bull Run, fought over much of the same ground as the first, was a far larger, bloodier, and more sophisticated engagement. It demonstrated how much both armies had learned and evolved in a year of war, but it also underscored the Confederacy's continued ability, under Lee's brilliant leadership, to outfight and outgeneral its northern opponents in Virginia. The road to Antietam had begun with a resounding Confederate triumph. Fresh from his decisive victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run in late August 1862, General Robert E. Lee made the audacious decision to carry the war into the North for the first time. His Army of Northern Virginia, though weary from months of campaigning, was confident and its morale high. Lee had several strategic objectives for invading Maryland: to relieve pressure on Virginia by taking the war out of the state during the harvest season, to gain much-needed supplies and recruits from the theoretically pro-Confederate population of Maryland, a border state that had remained in the Union, to influence upcoming Northern elections by demonstrating Confederate strength, and, perhaps most importantly, to achieve a significant military victory on Northern soil that might persuade Great Britain and France to grant diplomatic recognition to the Confederacy and potentially intervene on its behalf. In early September 1862, Lee's army, numbering around 55,000 men, crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. His advance, however, was not as smooth as hoped. Marylanders proved less enthusiastic about joining the Confederate cause than anticipated, and his army suffered from straggling and desertions due to exhaustion and lack of shoes. Major General George B. McClellan, restored to command of the Union Army of the Potomac, which now incorporated elements of Pope's defeated Army of Virginia, moved cautiously northward from Washington, D.C. to intercept Lee. McClellan, though a superb organizer and popular with his troops, was notoriously hesitant and consistently overestimated Lee's strength. However, a remarkable stroke of luck befell him. On September 13th, near Frederick, Maryland, a Union soldier discovered a lost copy of Lee's Special Order Number 191, which detailed Lee's entire campaign plan, including the division of his army. This lost order revealed that Lee had dispatched Major General Stonewall Jackson with a significant portion of the army to capture the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, leaving Lee with a dangerously dispersed and outnumbered force. Armed with this invaluable intelligence, McClellan had a golden opportunity to defeat Lee's divided army in detail. However, his characteristic caution led him to delay, giving Lee precious time to react. McClellan did advance more rapidly than usual, forcing Lee to concentrate his scattered forces. On September 14th, Union forces attacked Confederate rearguards at the Battle of South Mountain and Crampton's Gap, successfully forcing their way through the mountain passes, but not quickly enough to prevent Lee from beginning to consolidate his army. Lee chose to make a stand near the small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, with his back to the Potomac River and Antietam Creek, a tributary of the Potomac, to his front. It was a perilous position, with the river potentially cutting off his line of retreat. He deployed his army, initially numbering only about 18,000 men, as he awaited Jackson's arrival from Harper's Ferry, which surrendered to Jackson on September 15th, along a low ridge running roughly north-south, west of Antietam Creek. McClellan's army, numbering around 75,000 men, though he would commit only about 2/3 of this force to the actual fighting, began to arrive opposite Lee's position on September 15th and 16th. McClellan, despite his numerical superiority and knowledge of Lee's dispositions, spent September 16th reconnoitering and formulating his plan of attack, again giving Lee more time for Jackson's divisions and other detached Confederate units to arrive and strengthen the Confederate line. By the morning of September 17th, Lee had managed to concentrate around 38,000 to 40,000 men. McClellan's plan was to launch a series of powerful but sequential, rather than simultaneous, attacks against Lee's flanks, first on the Confederate left, north, then on the right, south, and finally, if necessary, an assault on the Confederate center. He hoped to crush Lee's smaller army through sheer weight of numbers. The battle began at dawn on September 17, 1862, a day that would become the single bloodiest day in American military history. The first Union assault was delivered by Major General Joseph Hooker's Thuff Corps against Jackson's divisions under Lawton and J.R. Jones on the Confederate left in an area around the Dunker Church, the North Woods, East Woods, and a prominent cornfield owned by David R. Miller, the Cornfield. The fighting in the cornfield was horrific and unrelenting. Control of the 30-acre field swayed back and forth as Union and Confederate brigades charged and countercharged through the tall stalks of corn. Artillery on both sides, often firing at close range, inflicted devastating casualties. Hooker's corps made initial gains, but was met by fierce Confederate resistance. Jackson's veterans, though outnumbered, fought with their characteristic tenacity. As Hooker's attack faltered, Major General Joseph K. Mansfield's 12th Corps was sent in to support him. Mansfield himself was mortally wounded early in the advance. The 12th Corps also became heavily engaged in the chaotic fighting around the cornfield and the East Woods, with units becoming intermingled and suffering heavy losses. The carnage was so intense that the cornfield was described as having been cut down as if by a scythe, with bodies littering the ground. Around 9 a.m., Major General Edwin V. Sumner's 2nd Corps entered the battle. Sumner, without adequate reconnaissance, led Brigadier General John Sedgwick's division in a dense formation into the West Woods, just beyond the cornfield. Here, they were caught in a devastating Confederate flank attack delivered by newly arrived Confederate divisions under McLaws and Walker, from Longstreet's command, shifted from the right. Sedgwick's division was shattered in a matter of minutes, suffering over 2,200 casualties in what became known as the West Woods Massacre. This disaster effectively ended the major Union offensive on the Confederate left. While the fighting raged on the northern end of the field, McClellan ordered an attack against the Confederate center. Here, D.H. Hill's Confederate division occupied a strong defensive position along a sunken farm lane, which would earn the grim nickname Bloody Lane. Around 9:30 a.m., elements of Sumner's 2nd Corps, specifically Brigadier General William H. French's and Major General Israel B. Richardson's divisions, launched a series of frontal assaults against this entrenched Confederate position. For nearly 4 hours, Union and Confederate soldiers engaged in a brutal close-range slugfest along Bloody Lane. The Confederates, protected by the natural trench, poured a murderous fire into the advancing Union lines. Repeated Union assaults were repulsed with staggering losses. However, through sheer determination and weight of numbers, Union troops eventually managed to gain a foothold on the crest of the ridge overlooking the lane. A mistaken Confederate order then led to the withdrawal of some Confederate units from the lane, creating a breach. Union soldiers poured through, and the Confederate center collapsed. By around 1 p.m., the Confederate line at Bloody Lane was broken. A decisive opportunity existed for McClellan to exploit this breakthrough and potentially split Lee's army in two. However, McClellan, ever cautious and perhaps lacking a clear understanding of the situation, failed to commit his ample reserves, including Fitz-John Porter's entire V Corps and Franklin's Sixth Corps, which had arrived but was only partially engaged, to deliver a finishing blow. The opportunity passed, and Lee was able to patch together a new defensive line. While the fighting was concluding in the center, the third phase of McClellan's plan unfolded on the Confederate right flank, south of Sharpsburg. Here, Major General Ambrose E. Burnside's Ninth Corps was tasked with capturing a stone bridge, later known as Burnside's Bridge, over Antietam Creek, and then advancing to strike Lee's right flank and cut off his line of retreat towards Boatler's Ford on the Potomac. Burnside's operations were plagued by delays and indecision. For several hours, repeated Union attempts to storm the narrow, well-defended bridge were repulsed by a small but determined force of about 500 Georgia riflemen under Brigadier General Robert Toombs, positioned on the high ground overlooking the bridge. Finally, around 1 p.m., coinciding with the breakthrough at Bloody Lane, a Union charge led by the 51st New York and 51st Pennsylvania Infantry successfully carried the bridge. However, even after capturing the bridge, Burnside took another 2 hours to reorganize his corps and begin his advance towards Sharpsburg. This delay proved critical. Just as Burnside's troops were finally beginning to threaten Lee's vulnerable right flank, Major General A.P. Hill's Confederate Light Division, which had been left at Harper's Ferry to parole the Union prisoners, arrived on the field after a grueling forced march of 17 miles in 8 hours. A.P. Hill's timely arrival around 3:30 p.m. or 4 p.m. was a godsend for Lee. Hill's fresh troops slammed into Burnside's exposed left flank, halting the Union advance and then driving it back towards Antietam Creek. Burnside's attack, which had held the potential to win the battle for the Union, collapsed. As darkness fell on September 17th, the fighting sputtered to a close. The battlefield was a horrific landscape of death and suffering. Over 22,700 soldiers from both sides were killed, wounded, or missing in approximately 12 hours of combat, making Antietam the single bloodiest day in American military history. Union casualties numbered around 12,410, 2,108 killed, 9,549 wounded, 753 missing, captured. Confederate casualties were approximately 10,316, 1,546 killed, 7,752 wounded, 1,018 missing, captured. Proportionally, Lee's smaller army suffered much heavier losses. Despite the horrific casualties and the battered state of his army, Lee kept his army on the field throughout September 18th, daring McClellan to renew the attack. McClellan, however, with his army also severely bloodied and his characteristic caution reasserting itself, declined to resume the offensive despite still having significant fresh reserves. During the night of September 18th to 19th, Lee skillfully withdrew his battered army of Northern Virginia back across the Potomac River into Virginia, ending his first invasion of the North. Tactically, the Battle of Antietam was a stalemate, though the Confederates, having been driven from their positions and forced to retreat from Maryland, could be considered to have suffered a strategic defeat. Lee's Maryland campaign had failed to achieve its major objectives. He had not gained significant recruits or supplies, nor had he won the decisive victory on northern soil that might have led to foreign recognition. However, the battle had profound political and strategic consequences for the Union. Though not the crushing victory some had hoped for, Antietam was enough of a Union success to give President Abraham Lincoln the political capital he needed to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. This historic proclamation declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory would be freed on January 1, 1863. It fundamentally transformed the character of the war, explicitly linking it to the abolition of slavery and making it much more difficult for anti-slavery European powers like Great Britain and France to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy. McClellan's failure to aggressively pursue Lee after Antietam and destroy his weakened army drew heavy criticism and ultimately led to his final removal from command by President Lincoln in November 1862. The Battle of Antietam remains a grim testament to the ferocity and horror of Civil War combat. The fighting at the Cornfield, Bloody Lane, and Burnside's Bridge became legendary for its intensity and the sheer scale of human suffering. The battle starkly illustrated the deadly effectiveness of rifled muskets and artillery when used by determined troops in strong defensive positions. It was a day of unparalleled carnage that seared itself into the American consciousness and played a crucial role in shaping the future course of the war and the nation. In the late summer and early autumn of 1862, while Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was engaged in the Maryland campaign in the east, a major Confederate offensive was also underway in the Western Theater. This offensive, known as the Kentucky Campaign, was a bold attempt by the Confederacy to reclaim the crucial border state of Kentucky, gain recruits and supplies, and disrupt Union war efforts in the West. Two Confederate armies were involved. Major General Braxton Bragg's Army of Mississippi, later renamed the Army of Tennessee, and Major General Edmund Kirby Smith's Army of East Tennessee. Bragg and Kirby Smith launched a two-pronged invasion of Kentucky from eastern Tennessee. Kirby Smith achieved early success, defeating a raw Union force at the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, on August 30th, 1862, and subsequently occupying Lexington and Frankfort, the state capital. Bragg's larger army advanced northward, aiming to draw the main Union force in the region, Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio, into a decisive battle. Buell, whose primary mission was to protect Nashville and Chattanooga, was forced to abandon his southward advance and race northward to defend Kentucky and his supply lines. The Confederate campaign in Kentucky was marked by logistical difficulties, long marches in hot, dry weather, and a general lack of enthusiastic support from the Kentuckians, many of whom, despite Southern sympathies, were unwilling to actively join the Confederate cause, especially with a large Union army nearby. Bragg's hope of swelling his ranks with Kentucky volunteers largely failed to materialize. He did, however, manage to install a pro-Confederate governor, Richard Hawes, at Frankfort, though this government had little real authority. By early October, Buell's Army of the Ohio, numbering around 55,000 men, though not all would be engaged, had concentrated near Louisville and was advancing eastward to confront Bragg. Bragg, whose army was somewhat dispersed and outnumbered by Buell's total force, decided to consolidate his troops and seek a favorable engagement. He ordered Major General Leonidas Polk, one of his wing commanders, to concentrate several divisions near the small crossroads town of Perryville in central Kentucky. Bragg himself was at Harrodsburg, a short distance away, believing the main Union thrust would come from that direction. On October 7, 1862, advance elements of Buell's army, specifically the 1st Corps under Major General Alexander M. McCook, began to skirmish with Confederate cavalry and infantry near Perryville. The area around Perryville was suffering from a severe drought, and control of water sources, particularly Doctors Creek, also known as Chaplin River, and its tributaries, became a critical factor. Both armies were desperately seeking water for their men and horses. Buell, unfortunately, was suffering from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse and was not always in close contact with his forward elements. He also mistakenly believed that the main Confederate force was still at Frankfort or Harrodsburg, and that the Confederates at Perryville were merely a diversion or a rearguard. This misapprehension, combined with poor communication and an unusual atmospheric phenomenon known as an acoustic shadow, which prevented Buell and some of his corps commanders from clearly hearing the sounds of the battle raging just a few miles away, would lead to a piecemeal commitment of Union forces. On the morning of October 8, 1862, the Battle of Perryville, also known as the Battle of Chaplin Hills, began in earnest. The initial fighting centered on the struggle for water along Doctors Creek. Union troops from McCook's 1st Corps advanced to secure water sources and encountered increasingly stiff Confederate resistance. The Confederate forces at Perryville, numbering about 16,000 men, were primarily from Polk's right wing of Bragg's army, consisting of divisions under Major Generals Benjamin F. Cheatham and Simon Bolivar Buckner, who had been exchanged after his capture at Fort Donelson. Major General William J. Hardee's left wing was also present with some of his troops. Bragg arrived on the field from Harrodsburg around 10 a.m., and, despite being outnumbered by Buell's overall army, decided to authorize an attack, believing he faced only a portion of the Union force. Around 2 p.m., the Confederates launched a major assault, primarily directed against McCook's Corps on the Union left flank. Cheatham's division, spearheaded by Brigadier General Daniel S. Donelson's brigade, slammed into Brigadier General James S. Jackson's raw 10th Division. The inexperienced Union troops, caught in an exposed position and hit by a furious Confederate charge, quickly buckled and were driven back in considerable disorder. General Jackson himself was killed early in the attack, further disorganizing his division. The Confederate assault then rolled up McCook's left flank, pushing back Brigadier General Lovell H. Rousseau's 3rd Division, which put up a much stiffer resistance. The fighting on this part of the field, particularly around the H.P. Bottom House and on a series of rocky, wooded hills, was desperate and bloody. Union artillery batteries fought heroically, often firing canister at point-blank range to slow the Confederate advance, but many were overrun. For several hours, McCook's I Corps, numbering only about 13,000 men, bore the brunt of the Confederate attack without significant support from the other 2 Union corps on the field. Major General Thomas L. Crittenden's 2nd Corps and Major General Charles C. Gilbert's 3rd Corps. Gilbert was temporarily commanding as the actual commander, Major General William Bull Nelson, had recently been murdered by a fellow Union general in Louisville. Buell, still miles from the heaviest fighting and apparently unaware of its intensity due to the acoustic shadow, was slow to order reinforcements to McCook's aid. Some Union brigades, like Colonel John C. Starkweather's brigade of Rousseau's division and Colonel William H. Lytle's brigade, Lytle was severely wounded and captured, fought with particular distinction, making stubborn stands that bought precious time. The 15th Kentucky, Union, and the 1st Tennessee, Confederate, engaged in a particularly fierce struggle. By late afternoon, McCook's corps was on the verge of collapse. However, as Confederate momentum began to wane due to exhaustion and casualties, and as some Union reinforcements from Gilbert's corps finally began to arrive on McCook's right, the Union line managed to stabilize. Brigadier General Philip H. Sheridan's division of Gilbert's corps launched a vigorous counterattack near the village of Perryville, which helped to check the Confederate advance in that sector. The fighting continued until darkness fell, with neither side achieving a decisive breakthrough. The Confederates had driven back the Union left flank for over a mile and inflicted heavy casualties, but they had failed to shatter McCook's corps completely or achieve a larger strategic victory. The bulk of Buell's army had not been fully engaged. During the night, Bragg learned that he was facing a much larger portion of Buell's army than he had initially believed. With his own troops exhausted and low on ammunition, and with the prospect of facing overwhelming Union numbers the next day, Bragg made the decision to withdraw his army from Perryville. He ordered a retreat southward, eventually linking up with Kirby Smith's forces, and then withdrawing from Kentucky altogether, back into Tennessee. The Battle of Perryville was the largest and most significant battle fought in Kentucky during the Civil War. It was a brutal and bloody engagement, particularly for the units involved. Union casualties numbered around 4,276, 894 killed, 2,911 wounded, 471 missing, captured. Confederate casualties were approximately 3,401, 532 killed, 2,641 wounded, 228 missing, captured. Proportionally, both sides suffered heavily. Tactically, the battle could be considered a Confederate victory, as they had attacked and driven back a portion of the Union Army, inflicting more casualties than they sustained in some estimates, though this is debated. However, strategically, Perryville was a Union victory because it halted Bragg's Confederate offensive in Kentucky and forced him to retreat from the state. The Confederacy's best chance to reclaim Kentucky had been lost. Kentucky would remain firmly under Union control for the remainder of the war, a critical strategic advantage for the North. The Kentucky campaign and the Battle of Perryville had significant consequences for the commanders involved. Braxton Bragg faced severe criticism in the Confederacy for his handling of the campaign and his decision to retreat from Kentucky after the battle. His leadership would remain controversial throughout the war. Don Carlos Buell also came under heavy criticism in the North for his perceived slowness in pursuing Bragg, his failure to bring his entire army into action at Perryville, and his inability to achieve a decisive victory. Shortly after the battle, Buell was relieved of command of the Army of the Ohio, which was reorganized and eventually placed under the command of Major General William S. Rosecrans, who would lead it at the Battle of Stones River. The Battle of Perryville highlighted the brutal nature of Civil War combat and the importance of leadership and communication on the battlefield. The acoustic shadow phenomenon played a bizarre but significant role in preventing Buell from fully understanding the desperate situation of his left flank. The battle also underscored the strategic importance of the border states and the fierce struggle for their control. Though often overshadowed by the larger battles in the Eastern Theater, Perryville was a pivotal engagement in the West, effectively ending the last major Confederate offensive in Kentucky and securing the state for the Union. The parched fields and rocky hills around Perryville had witnessed a desperate struggle that significantly shaped the course of the war in the Trans-Appalachian region. As 1862 drew to a close, the strategic situation in the Western Theater remained fluid and critical. Following the Confederate retreat from Kentucky after the Battle of Perryville, Major General William S. Rosecrans had replaced Major General Don Carlos Buell in command of the Union Army of the Ohio, which was soon reorganized and renamed the Army of the Cumberland. Rosecrans, an energetic and meticulous, if sometimes indecisive commander, concentrated his army of approximately 44,000 men in Nashville, Tennessee, preparing for an offensive against General Braxton Bragg's Confederate Army of Tennessee. Bragg's army, numbering around 38,000, had established a defensive position near Murfreesboro, a town about 30 miles southeast of Nashville, along the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad and the Stones River. Bragg was determined to hold Middle Tennessee and protect the vital agricultural and industrial resources of the region. Both armies settled into winter quarters, but pressure from Washington mounted on Rosecrans to advance against Bragg and achieve a Union victory to bolster Northern morale, which had been battered by the Fredericksburg disaster in the East. On December 26, 1862, Rosecrans finally put his army in motion, advancing from Nashville towards Murfreesboro in 3 columns. Bragg, alerted to the Union advance, concentrated his forces to meet the threat. His army was organized into 2 main infantry corps under Lieutenant Generals William J. Hardee and Leonidas Polk, with a separate cavalry command under Brigadier General Joseph Wheeler. Wheeler's cavalry skillfully harassed the Union advance, providing Bragg with valuable intelligence. By the evening of December 30th, the 2 armies faced each other in lines of battle just west and north of Murfreesboro, separated by a few hundred yards in some places. The terrain was characterized by rocky limestone outcroppings, dense cedar thickets, and open cotton fields, all bisected by the meandering Stones River. Both Rosecrans and Bragg, remarkably, devised similar battle plans, each intended to attack the enemy's right flank at dawn on December 31st, hoping to turn the flank, get into the enemy's rear, and cut off their line of retreat along the Nashville Pike for the Confederates, or the railroad for the Union. The army that struck first with the most force would likely gain a significant advantage. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 31st, 1862, it was Braxton Bragg who managed to launch his attack first. Hardee's corps, spearheaded by Major General John P. McCown's division, slammed into the unsuspecting right flank of Rosecrans's army, held by Major General Alexander M. McCook's right wing. The Confederate assault, delivered with surprise and ferocity around 6 a.m., caught the Union troops, many of whom were still preparing breakfast, completely off guard. McCown's and Major General Patrick Cleburne's divisions of Hardee's corps quickly overran the initial Union positions, shattering Brigadier General Richard W. Johnson's division and then Brigadier General Jefferson C. Davis's division. Union regiments collapsed and soldiers fled in panic, abandoning artillery and equipment. The Confederate attack rolled up McCook's line from right to left like a closing door. For a time, it appeared that the Union right wing would be completely routed and the entire Army of the Cumberland might be destroyed. The situation for the Union Army was desperate. Brigadier General Philip H. Sheridan's division, positioned to the left of Davis, found itself under immense pressure as its right flank was exposed by the collapse of the divisions next to it. Sheridan, a tenacious and aggressive fighter, skillfully maneuvered his 3 brigades, fighting a desperate delaying action as they were slowly pushed back. Sheridan's division changed front multiple times, inflicting heavy casualties on the advancing Confederates and buying precious time for Rosecrans to react and establish a new defensive line. All 3 of Sheridan's brigade commanders were killed or mortally wounded in this savage fighting. Rosecrans, initially at his headquarters further to the rear, rode to the sound of the guns and worked furiously to rally his troops and prevent a complete disaster. He was a conspicuous figure on the battlefield, seemingly oblivious to personal danger. His chief of staff, Colonel Julius Garrichet, was decapitated by a cannonball while riding beside him. Rosecrans managed to pull troops from his unengaged left flank, Major General Thomas L. Crittenden's left wing, which had been preparing for its own abortive dawn attack, and rush them to the threatened right and center. A crucial stand was made by Colonel William B. Hazen's brigade of Palmer's division, Crittenden's Corps, which occupied a strong position in a dense, rocky patch of woods known as the Round Forest, near the Nashville Pike and the railroad. For several hours, Hazen's brigade, supported by other rallied units and artillery, repulsed repeated Confederate assaults from Polk's Corps, Cheatham's and Withers divisions. The fighting in the Round Forest, later dubbed Hell's Half Acre by the soldiers, was incredibly intense and bloody. Hazen's men held their ground, forming a vital anchor for the reformed Union line. By late morning, the Union Army had been bent back almost at a right angle, forming a new defensive line roughly parallel to the Nashville Pike. The Confederates had achieved significant tactical success, driving the Union right flank back nearly 3 miles. But they had failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough or cut off the Union line of retreat. The fierce resistance of units like Sheridan's division and Hazen's brigade, coupled with the exhaustion of the Confederate attackers and the difficult terrain, had slowed the Southern momentum. The fighting continued throughout the afternoon, with Bragg committing more troops from Polk's Corps in an attempt to break the new Union line, particularly at the Round Forest. However, the Union defenses, now more concentrated and supported by massed artillery, held firm. As darkness fell on December 31st, the first day of the Battle of Stones River ended. Both armies were exhausted and had suffered horrific casualties. The Confederates held much of the ground, but the Union Army, though severely battered, had not been broken. That night, Rosecrans held a council of war with his corps commanders. Despite the day's setbacks and the heavy losses, Rosecrans, supported by key subordinates like Major General George H. Thomas, commander of the Center Wing, made the courageous decision to hold his position and fight it out. He famously declared, "We will fight or die right here." Reinforcements were brought up, and the Union line was strengthened. New Year's Day, January 1st, 1863, was relatively quiet, with both armies largely reorganizing and tending to their wounded. There was some skirmishing and artillery fire, but no major assaults. Bragg, believing Rosecrans would retreat, was surprised to find the Union Army still in position. On January 2nd, Bragg ordered Major General John C. Breckinridge's division from Hardee's Corps, which had been positioned on the east side of the Stones River and had seen little action on the first day, to attack a Union division under Colonel Samuel Beatty, commanding Van Cleve's division of Crittenden's Corps, that had occupied a commanding hill on the east bank of the river. Breckinridge, who had protested the order, believing the position to be too strong, reluctantly launched the assault around 4 p.m. Breckinridge's initial attack was successful, driving Beatty's Union troops from the hill. However, as the Confederates pursued, they came under a devastating converging fire from over 50 Union cannons massed on the west bank of the Stones River by Major John Mendenhall, Rosecrans's chief of artillery. In a matter of minutes, Breckinridge's division suffered horrendous casualties, over 1,700 men in less than an hour, and was forced to fall back in disorder. This bloody repulse effectively ended any further Confederate offensive action. On January 3rd, Bragg, faced with a determined enemy, heavy casualties and dwindling supplies, and concerned about reports of Union reinforcements, made the difficult decision to withdraw his army from Murfreesboro. His retreat began that night, southward towards Tullahoma, Tennessee. Rosecrans's army, though also badly battered, occupied Murfreesboro on January 5th. The Battle of Stones River was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War relative to the numbers engaged. Union casualties were approximately 13,249, 1,730 killed, 7,802 wounded, 3,717 missing captured, out of about 41,400 engaged. Confederate casualties were around 10,266, 1,294 killed, 7,945 wounded, 1,027 missing captured, out of about 34,700. The casualty rate for both armies was nearly 1/3, a staggering testament to the ferocity of the fighting. Tactically, the battle was largely a draw, with both sides suffering immensely and neither achieving a decisive victory on the field. However, strategically, Stones River was a crucial Union victory. Bragg's Confederate army had been forced to retreat, ceding control of Middle Tennessee to the Union and abandoning a rich agricultural area. The victory provided a much-needed boost to Northern morale, especially coming after the Fredericksburg disaster. President Lincoln, upon hearing of the outcome, wrote to Rosecrans, "I can never forget, whilst I remember anything, that you gave us a hard-earned victory, which had there been a defeat instead, the nation could scarcely have lived over." The Battle of Stones River highlighted the tenacity of the common soldier on both sides, who endured horrific conditions and fought with incredible bravery. It also showcased the leadership of Rosecrans, who, despite the initial surprise and near disaster, managed to rally his army and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Bragg's generalship, on the other hand, came under renewed criticism in the Confederacy for his failure to achieve a decisive victory despite the initial success of his attack and for his subsequent retreat. The battlefield itself, with landmarks like the Round Forest, Hell's Half-Acre, became a symbol of the brutal and often indecisive nature of Civil War combat. The fight for Middle Tennessee would continue, but Stones River marked a significant step in the Union's long and bloody campaign to control the Western theater. The bloody New Year's fight had secured a vital strategic gain for the Union and demonstrated the resilience of the Army of the Cumberland.